I am recording this now. Anyways, okay, so our first paper is titled Medicalization and Mission, Implications of Disability in Catholic Schools. This is presented by Dorothy Goehring and from Boston College and Matthew Windels from Loyola School.
Goehring, actually.
I'm sorry?
Goehring.
Goehring, thank you. Dorothy is a PhD student at Boston College, concentrating in comparative theology with a focus on medical ethics. And Matthew is a PhD candidate at Fordham University's Graduate School of Education and Administration and Supervision, and an English and Spanish teacher at Loyola School in New York City. And he also lives with cerebral palsy. So I invite you now to present.
All right, thank you, everybody. Do you want to share our PowerPoint?
Oh, yes, that's right.
We need to share the screen.
Yeah, I know. Sorry.
It's okay.
Sorry, everyone.
All right. With the advent of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, in 1990, the protection of the rights and privileges of disabled people across the United States was thrust into the forefront of the consciousness of the American public. As awareness of disability in its various forms has grown, the idea of disability as a minority classification has grown as well, culminating in the gradual formation of a distinct disability culture. In a 2002 issue of Disability Studies Quarterly, Stephen E. Brown states that, quote, disability culture is not the same as how different cultures treat different disabilities. Instead, disability culture is a set of artifacts, beliefs, expressions created by disabled people ourselves to describe our own life experiences. It is not primarily how we are treated, but what we have created, unquote. As one can infer based on Brown's explanation, disability culture as a subgroup of diversity is widely disparate and nebulous, especially given increased recognition of cognitive, emotional, and behavioral disorders as disabilities, rather than simply being thought of as diseases or social ills. It is therefore difficult to address disability culture as a whole. As a result, many educational institutions tend to only be able to accommodate certain physical, mental, and emotional impairments, often neglecting the treatment and accommodation of others out of necessity, to the point where students with certain disabilities that require adjustment to learning environments are unable to perform effectively on academic and co-curricular levels. The medicalization of disability through the ADA and other relevant policies within the context of Catholic educational institutions has indeed provided some level of accommodation for disabled students and staff. By approaching disability as a medical phenomenon primarily, however, Catholic schools are limited in ways that disability can be addressed, accommodated, and affirmed. This leads to many relevant theological and bioethical implications for the status of the disabled person in Christianity and the wider world. Beginning in the 1960s and 70s, theological bioethics emerged as a growing field of inquiry which asserts that theological thinkers have something to say about the ethical implications of science, health, and technology. Beginning with concerns about the ethics of birth, death, and dying, and emerging biotechnological interventions, theological bioethics has grown to include a diversity of voices from many religious and theological points of view, and encompass a multiplicity of issues, including the status of the disabled person. The Catholic theological bioethics voice has emerged as a distinctive contributor toward larger bioethical and theological issues that concern the human person. In her pioneering work that fuses theological bioethics with Catholic social teaching, Catholic ethicist Lisa Soul Cahill asserts that in considering the myriad issues of bioethics, theologians can and should make contributions to larger conversations of public policy and social change, stating that, quote, theological bioethics can and should take account of grassroots movements and their mid-level and transnational counterparts in its normative delineations of the common good and of social organizations that support it, Christian theological bioethics must help make the case that different ways of doing things are both morally desirable and possible. Not resting content with seeking the moral high ground, forming countercultural communities apart from society, or inveighing against national and international policy setters, theological bioethics must renew efforts toward involvement in social and political processes. It must recognize, put down roots in, and energetically promote widespread, multi-leveled, and participatory efforts to change the status quo." End quote. Cahill's assertions are applicable within multiple public forums and can have unique implications for school policies. By virtue of their sponsorship by the Catholic Church, it can be considered that Catholic schools have an obligation to adhere to Catholic doctrine, including Catholic bioethical doctrine. It is worth noting that in many cases, bioethical considerations are based around a given issue or problem according to medical models. And this is especially true with regard to understanding disability. Courtney Wilder offers the following explanation. Quote, "The medical model of disability tends to focus on what the individual body cannot do, often with the goal of intervening and treating the person so that his or her body is or seems more in keeping with the normal body." Normal is in quotes. Unlike the social model, the medical and rehabilitation models identify disability as a problem within the body of the person living with the disability. Of course, people with and without disabilities benefit from medical care. However, if the medical and rehabilitation models are the primary means of understanding the body, it can be construed as defective. Rejecting this construct of disability allows for the positive and for the positive and affirming understanding of their own bodies that many people with disabilities experience. This shifts the obligation for access away from the body and the individual to the social structure. It also opens the way for critique of social and religious norms as the locus of problems for people with disabilities. End quote. Many disability theologians advocate for a shift from this medical model to a more social model, which asserts that disability is socially constructed. This is to say that disability is located in the social responses to a person with various impairments. Someone who utilizes assistive technology to move can move just fine until they run into obstacles blocking their access, such as stairs and no ramps. In affirming Cahill's contention of an engaged Catholic theological bioethics, it becomes necessary that Catholic schools work to step away from the medical model of disability in forming their accommodations policies and toward a more holistic social model.
In order to properly contextualize the aims of this paper and provide a reasonable benchmark and point of comparison, one has to acknowledge the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. The IDEA requires students with disabilities to be provided with, quote, "a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living," end quote. While the IDEA's provisions pertain to public education, they are standards to which one can in turn hold the comprehensiveness of Catholic school accommodation standards. The IDEA additionally allocates some federal funding for the accommodation of students with disabilities in private schools, as provisioned by Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, quote, "No otherwise qualified individual with a disability in the United States, as defined in Section 720, shall, solely by reason of her or his disability, be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance or under any program or activity conducted by any executive agency," end quote. The amount and extent of that funding, however, varies depending on myriad factors, including but not limited to whether or not free and public education is available to the individual student, and whether or not said public education constitutes an inclusive, least restrictive environment. When examining the accommodation and inclusion of students, with disabilities in Catholic schools, it is also necessary to identify the barriers to said accommodation and inclusion. According to a 2016 survey of Midwestern Catholic school principals done by Boyle and Hernandez, quote, 55 principals identified the major obstacles at their schools, and 3 themes emerged from their responses. A, financial constraints. B, teachers' lack of experience and training in working with children with disabilities. And C, teachers' perceptions and attitudes regarding inclusion. Financial constraints were the most frequently reported barriers, which constituted 43.6% of responding principals, followed by teachers' lack of experience and training at 29.1%, and teachers' perceptions at 18.2%. In this case, the choice to limit the study of Catholic school principals to a single Midwestern state is due to both policy and funding allocation varying from state to state, thereby providing a sample size with one fewer variable. The authors of this paper recognize the limitations of this sample as well as the dangers therein posed by generalizing on said sample. Financial constraints, as defined by Boyle and Hernandez's study, boil down to a lack of resources. In clarifying this obstacle, participants in the survey clarified that they did not have the requisite funds for, quote, additional classroom space, more assistive technology, additional professional staff, counselor, social worker, resource teacher, speech therapist, occupational therapist, or more tutors, and more in-service training, end quote. An important distinction to be made is that few of the participants objected to the idea of educating students with disabilities, but rather communicated the lack of resources needed to do so. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, however, requires any institution that benefits from federal funding to comply with IDEA regulations. As specified in Section 504, federal funding can be defined as, quote, any grant, loan, contract other than a procurement contract or a contract of insurance or guarantee, or any other arrangement by which the Department of Education provides or otherwise makes available assistance, end quote. A major confounding factor in this endeavor is predicated on the availability of diocesan funds. By virtue of size, constituency, and geographic location, among other factors, diocesan funding varies from diocese to diocese, therefore limiting any sort of standardized diocesan funding for accommodation or modification purposes. An appropriate recommendation to remedy this would be to increase the allocation of diocesan funding of accommodation programs to be automatically applied to diocesan schools, as the current practice requires schools to individually apply diocesan grants. The second major hurdle for sample schools to overcome was identified as a lack of teacher preparation or training for creating and maintaining inclusive classrooms. A large portion of the aforementioned lack of preparation is that while schools are generally prepared and willing to implement professional development programs and workshops, the understanding and definition of disability is not static, but rather constantly changing. The tendency is for individuals and institutions alike to consider their education on the topic complete once an individual training session or sequence of sessions has ended. In order for educators to be prepared to continuously foster welcoming, inclusive environments for students with disabilities, continuing education needs to be implemented. An appropriate recommendation to be implemented would be for all North American dioceses to adopt a standardized curriculum of professional development and training for Catholic educators nationwide to regularly hone their craft for the benefit of all their students. The third and potentially most volatile of the obstacles outlined is that of teacher perception. According to Boyle and Hernandez, principals had concerns related to the, quote, mindset, end quote, of these teachers, and reported that in addition to a lack of commitment, teachers demonstrated a lack of flexibility and adaptability. For example, one principal stated that some teachers, quote, do not support new teaching methods and are very unwilling to change, end quote. This principle suggested that the inclusion of students with disabilities in regular education classrooms requires teachers to adopt new instructional methods, and some teachers are unwilling to make those necessary changes to their instruction, end quote. This does not appear to be an easy problem to solve, and is no all-encompassing, elegant solution to be implemented. In addressing this obstacle, the integration of accommodation and inclusion into Catholic school mission is of vital importance. If properly reframed as part of the mission of Catholic education, steps can be taken to reaffirm individual educators' commitment to Catholic education. If reaffirmed, accommodation and inclusion will ideally empower all Catholic educators, including those with resistant mindsets, to reimagine any necessary accommodation as part of their calling as educators, rather than just another task to be completed. For those Catholic school educators who are less mission driven, appropriate steps can be taken to build necessary practices into their contracts. Final recommendations. Catholic theological bioethics can directly inform school policies in advocating for and accommodating disabled students. By moving away from a medical model of disability, a school can ensure that their students and their bodies are treated with the inherent dignity and care that Catholic doctrine demands. While funding and training are larger overarching problems that can directly affect support for disabled students, there are many resources and models available for Catholic schools to use. In addition, by ensuring that teachers engage in ongoing professional development and training, they will become more adept at navigating ways to fully support students. Thank you.
All right, thank you. That was like perfectly 15 minutes. Thank you for so much for your presentation. We do now have a respondent, Tatum Triacrico, is a student at Duke Divinity and a disability rights activist on Instagram. You can follow them at blind_person_in_area, as well as the California Foundation of Independent Living Centers Youth Organizing Program. She is the author who writes on disability history, justice, and culture, and the ways that intersects with the church. She has spoken at the San Diego, California Women's March, Point Loma Nazarene University's Crossing the Lines Conference, and many other classrooms and conferences on disability justice and theology. So please join me in welcoming Tatum.
Hi, thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, cool. So I'll give a brief image description and then I'll give my response paper. I'm a white woman with short brown hair and glasses, and I have a cream colored wall behind me with a disability pride flag, which has different colored zigzag lines on it, and then a desk that I do my homework at. And now I will go ahead and read my response paper. I really appreciated the way that you dove into this heavy topic of the crossroads of disability, education, and theology. I'm sure most of us are aware of the challenges that the education system has caused for disabled students, and the challenges that the church has presented as well. Taking this perspective to inclusion in Catholic schools is very important and nuanced, as you note really well in this paper. One of my favorite parts of your paper was that you started with the definition of disability culture. Opening with this definition helped ground us in a way of thinking that was honoring to disabled people and developed the idea of inclusion in schools around who disabled people are as a community, instead of just a task that needs to be handled. And then following that with the bioethical description of the social versus medical model really helps cement that disability is a culture and a way of being in the world that is either a positive or neutral identity, rather than just a medical situation. From there, moving into the legal understanding of what schools have to provide for disabled people makes sense and connects the social aspect of disability to the legal implications of what being disabled actually means in schools. This all builds up the three main points that you make at the end very well. If I'm understanding correctly, the Catholic school principals and your paper are advocating for three things: more funding, more training for teachers, and a change in teachers' perspectives on disability. As a functionally blind and otherwise disabled graduate student, I wholeheartedly agree that each of these three things needs to be implemented in schools. and especially Christian and Catholic schools, in order to support, and more than that, to honor all disabled students. I think it would be exciting to extend the disability cultural definition into the section on how Catholic schools should use these three concepts to make education more inclusive. While the suggestions you give seem like they would make a difference in the education system, I think disability cultural perspectives could impact them even further. For example, when thinking about the increasing funding in Catholic schools for accessibility, it would be cool to think through some of the disability justice and cultural principles from Sins Invalid. One of the concepts on their list is anti-capitalism and how disabled bodies don't fit into a capitalist society. So in order to have disability justice and culture, we have to develop new ways of thinking about money. Then in the other two sections about teacher training and perspective, I think about the concept of collective care that disabled activist Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Samarasinha defines in her book, Care Work, as shifting ideas of access and care from an individual chore to a collective responsibility that is maybe even deeply joyful. When thinking about Catholic and other Christian schools, I think expanding the way that we think about money and funds, as well as care for students, is really important. Practically, this could look like students supporting each other, teachers' perspectives being one of care of all of the student instead of just the mind of the student, or even just using funds in unique and unusual ways that end up caring for students in creative ways. In addition to that, I would love to explore these three areas of focus more as they relate to the Catholic bioethic position and other theological positions. I think Christian and Catholic schools in particular would really benefit from incorporating this kind of disability theology into the ways that they understand educating disabled people. First of all, thinking about Christ and the amount of time he spends with disabled people in the Bible makes me believe that more time should go into accommodating disabled students in these Catholic schools. Christians and Catholics also think about money in ways that are subversive to the dominant culture, as do disabled people. And so focusing more on funding disability access based on generosity, community, and other biblical ways of addressing money would make a significant difference for this point. Another cool theological connection to these points would be taking the idea of teacher training and perspective and linking it to Jesus as teacher and Jesus as wounded, disabled God after the resurrection, as theologian Nancy Eisland talks about. Understanding Christ as teacher and then thinking about the time he spent with disabled people would make teachers at these schools that care about the Bible think more often about the inclusion of disability. Along with that, thinking of our role as Catholics and Christians as one that is following Jesus, who is the disabled God, would give more weight to the role of disability in who God is. Thinking about these things in Catholic and Christian-based teacher training could lead to major perspective shifts. Ultimately, the paper that you have written outlines really helpful points that would point toward a much more inclusive way of understanding Catholic schools and disability inclusion. Adding some more particular conversation around disability culture and disability theology could take the 3 points you make a long way. All of this, as you explain well in your paper, will really help at bringing more access to disabled people in these schools. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tatum. I forgot to mention, we will be having a Q&A session after all the presenters, so feel free to keep questions in mind for us to ask all of our presenters at the end. With that, I'm going to stop spotlighting you, add you, and then you. Okay, all right. So our next presenter is Heather Morgan. The title of their paper is A Miracle We Can All Participate in, Hannah, Invisible Disability and the Transformative Power of Witness. Reverend Heather Morgan is a second-year MDiv student at Emmanuel College at the University of Toronto. She is a power wheelchair user with an undiagnosed neuromuscular condition and an associate pastor at Vox Alliance Church in Barrie. So please give a warm welcome to Reverend Heather Morgan.
Thank you, everyone. When it comes to questions of the Bible and disability, some disabilities are more prominent than others. Consideration of those who are blind, lame, and deaf abound in the literature and have been and continue to be extensively investigated through the work of disability theologians. Others, such as infertility, have also been considered from time to time, though there are many who point out the ways in which our use of these texts leaves much to be desired. But what are the voices and experiences of those with invisible disabilities? Just because their disabilities were and often remain invisible in the text, does that mean that their presence is fully absent or that their experiences remain outside of what we can learn on? Drawing on feminist, queer, and crip approaches to textual readings, I will argue that the miracle of Hannah's pregnancy has eclipsed a deeper miracle in the text, one that is found in an imaginative reading of Hannah as invisibly disabled. This transformed reading of 1 Samuel 1 and 2 allows the lived experiences of those with invisible disabilities to reveal liberative possibilities for the church that we can all both learn from and participate in. Invisible disabilities such as MS, ALS, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, myalgic encephalomyelitis, also called chronic fatigue syndrome, and thousands of other conditions that remain difficult to diagnose and elusive to treat even with modern medical advances, are absent from the pages of Scripture. Those who have developed long COVID over the past 2 years now swell the ranks of those with invisible disabilities in ways we have yet to even begin to consider socially, much less medically or theologically. Yet those currently affected by these invisible disabilities tell us that the pain and heartbreak of these conditions themselves is exacerbated substantially by the very invisibility they experience in relation to their condition. Feminist and disability studies writer Susan Windels notes that this, quote, epistemic invalidation, end quote, occurs when those with authority, quote, deny the reality of bodily experience, thus undermining our belief in ourselves as knowers, end quote. While Windels cites the authority of medical practitioners specifically in her explanation of this experience, the reality is that authority systems abound who may practice epistemic invalidation: medical, bureaucratic, occupational, academic, familial, and of course, religious. The core of epistemic invalidation is rooted in a failure of acknowledgement, in assumptions based on an elevation of the observer's lived experience over that of the lived experience of the one being observed. This is precisely what happened in and continues to happen through the story of Hannah. In the briefest of recaps, the story of Hannah is found in 1 Samuel 1 and 2 and tells of a childless woman going to the temple and begging with God for a son, God answering her prayer, and a child, Samuel, being born, who will go on to be a prophet for Israel at a time of need. The text tells us specifically that Eli the priest thought or assumed that she was drunk because she was, quote, praying silently, only her lips moved, end quote. Eli, the able-bodied male religious authority, made assumptions about Hannah solely on external observations based on his own experiences. Focusing in on this moment in the text, I note that those with many disabilities, including epilepsy, MS, acquired brain injury, ALS, hypothyroidism, diabetes, EDS, and more, all mimic drunkenness, and many also significantly impact a woman's fertility. Elevating the experiences and drawing from the context of those with invisible and undiagnosed disabilities who have experienced epistemic invalidation like Hannah, those who have been mistaken as being drunk because of their invisible disabilities particularly, offers new liberative connections from this text. It interjects the question, what if Hannah was not only a woman who was childless, but a woman with an invisible disability? What if her drunken appearance was not merely the outflow of her distress? This critical imagining of Hannah as a woman with a form of unnamed invisible disability not only offers possibilities that are worth exploring, but introduces a new redemptive miracle to our text. For the sake of this paper, I will imagine that Hannah had a form of epilepsy that caused absence seizures. Absence seizures can be very difficult to notice because at best, if you caught the person at the moment of their seizure, you might simply see them staring into the middle distance for a few seconds. The person experiencing them remembers nothing afterwards. If the person is walking at the time, they might stop walking or moving, but they won't fall over, and there will be none of the characteristic convulsions we typically think of when it comes to seizures. At most, these absent seizures can be accompanied by small movements of the lips, jaw, or fingers. While ancient Israelite texts are aware of epilepsy in its most visible form of tonic-clonic seizures, even today it can take years before absent seizures are detected and diagnosed. Typically, these seizures begin in childhood, most frequently in girls, and it's not until later adolescence, likely after Hannah would have been married to Elkanah, that these seizures may become visible as they shift into something like a complex partial seizure. Even then, they may remain vastly misunderstood. The problem is that, like so many other invisible disabilities, even when it's invisible, epilepsy still has impacts on those who have it. Over time, these seizures can cause learning impairments and other brain damage, including damage that can affect the hormonal system in ways that cause fertility issues. Leading up to a seizure, an individual may feel unwell from certain neurological symptoms. Following a seizure, an individual can enter a post-ictal state in which they may experience slurring of speech or difficulty with thinking clearly or moving smoothly, mimicking drunkenness. They may also feel extremely nauseated, and these symptoms can last anywhere from a few minutes to a few hours or even up to days. Although our imagined epileptic Hannah's seizures may not have been visible, their impact would have been tangible in her body. How many years of childlessness ensued before her husband decided to take a second wife to ensure that he had children of his own? Yet perhaps there was another reason why Elkanah chose to take a second wife. Perhaps Hannah struggled with her work. Perhaps there were hours of the day or even days of the week where she was so fatigued by the impact of her seizures that she couldn't get up to do the housework or cook the meals. Although we know polygamous relationships like this even today produce significant rivalries between first and second wives, perhaps the added inequalities in ability to work posed additional strain to her relationship with Peninnah. Perhaps Peninnah thought she was faking it or pretending to try to get out of her share of the work. As these ideas saturate our imaginations, other details rise in the text that were previously unnoticed. These types of seizures could easily have caused the loss of appetite that Hannah had at Shiloh that day. She may also have had a sense that she was going to have a seizure, and perhaps this even drove Hannah away from the family meal and back to the temple. Perhaps, in the face of her infertility and an invisible disability that she couldn't understand and didn't have words for, perhaps all the pain of everything she had gone through, all her humiliation and all her sorrow poured out in and around a complex partial seizure. How does this imaginative read of Hannah as epileptic open new ways of understanding epistemic invalidation theologically for us today? To begin with, we return to Eli's response to Hannah's reality. 1 Samuel 1:13-14 says, Eli thought she was drunk, so he said to her, "How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine." Many of the commentaries on this passage accept Eli's epistemic invalidation as not unreasonable. However, I contend that the writer of 1 Samuel did not, and we should not either. When we accept the witness of those with invisible disabilities, Eli's response immediately feels problematic, and we can note the ways it exercises epistemic invalidation in its failure to acknowledge Hannah's reality. Moreover, the next few chapters of 1 Samuel announce that Samuel's birth is the precursor to God's judgment against Eli and his failure as a father and a religious leader. As this is the first in a line of quickly reinforced vignettes of Eli, it is far more plausible to accept this epistemic invalidation of Hannah as the first sign by the author of 1 Samuel of Eli's incompetence to lead. The introduction of the perspective of those with invisible disabilities reifies a new awareness of what is going on in the text and suggests a new standard of acknowledgement necessary for those in positions of authority in the church. Furthermore, as biblical scholar Papanidani de Andrado has pointed out, we might notice with wonder the way in which Hannah takes agency in creating change in her world. By considering Hannah as an invisibly disabled woman who is epistemically invalidated by Eli and likely those in her family over the years, we can become curious about her ability to act with agency in this moment and to reject others' descriptions and assumptions of her lived experiences. Instead, we note that she seems to draw on a lifetime of deep spiritual practices and returns to the temple where, in ways that reflect the story of Jacob and are unique among women of the Hebrew Bible, she chooses to wrestle with God until God promises to bless her. What enables her to do this? In 1 Samuel 2:3, we read Hannah's contention that the Lord is a God of knowledge and by him actions are weighed. Hannah has rooted the validation of her lived experiences not in the authorities of those around her, but in her conviction that the Lord weighs our actions and the Lord knows. The arrogant words of her family and other authorities about Hannah didn't make them true. The assumptions of doctors and bureaucracies about myself and others with invisible disabilities don't make them correct either. If God knows all things and weighs all actions, then there is no authority that can take that away. Hannah's knowledge that God knows does not erase her pain, but as with oppressed peoples the world over, it drives her back to God and to her spiritual practices to uphold her through her pain and to affirm her lived realities, even when there are no words available to her to articulate these experiences in herself. Not only that, but this spiritual grounding gives her confidence in the face of the authority of Eli, the high priest, to contradict him to his face. Rooted as she is in knowing that God acknowledges her, Hannah can call Eli out. While such a courageous contradiction guarantees nothing in terms of the response of the one in authority, speaking up is nevertheless crucial for the mental and spiritual well-being of those of us who have experienced epistemic invalidation as we seek to affirm our own bodily realities. The most surprising turn in this story is the miracle that Eli pauses, listens, and responds with justice and mercy to Hannah's statement. I assert that this is the entirely missed but more significant miracle of the story. Eli miraculously accepts Hannah's lived reality. The epistemic invalidation Hannah has spent a lifetime facing is overturned in this miraculous moment. In this moment, the judgment, condemnation, criticism, and undermining of her experiences melt away as the words of Eli's blessing flow over her. Uncovering this miracle helps us in turn to better understand the words that follow in 1 Samuel 2 with Hannah's song. This song, seen by many in the church as the precursor to Mary's Magnificat, is a song about justice and inverted power structures. It is a song about the ways we should expect God to bring about tangible changes to the world around us. By considering this narrative through the lens of an epistemically invalidated epileptic Hannah, we uncover the incredible impacts of the power of witness, the miracle of having our epistemic realities accepted. This in turn allows this pericope to challenge those who would seek to assume that they understand another's position, as it simultaneously points to the justice and hope that are to be found when those whose lived experiences have been invalidated are finally given the acceptance and affirmation they deserve. Our imaginings of Hannah as a woman with an invisible disability provide us with opportunities to exegete the text of 1 Samuel 1 and 2 more deeply and more profoundly. The lived experiences of those with invisible disabilities who experience epistemic invalidation reveal layers of the text that are glossed over or missed by other scholars. As such, this approach explicates a more just standard to hold religious authorities to when dealing with those whose lived experiences are different from their own. It suggests the power of a deep spiritual practice for counteracting the effects of epistemic invalidation in the lives of affected individuals. It supports a posture of wrestling with God for those whose experiences have been invalidated. It honors those who fight back and demand that their voice is heard, even in the midst of deeply unjust systems and responses. And finally, it upholds an aspirational vision of inverted power dynamics, rooted in the power of witness for those who had previously been treated as invisible. Those with undiagnosed and invisible disabilities have often been left out of conversations in disability theology and biblical studies. It is my contention here that this oversight is to our detriment. As I have shown in this paper, making space for those with undiagnosed and invisible disabilities to read the text from our locus of experience offers up imaginative possibilities that uncover and expand exegetical perspectives, while simultaneously offering the power of witness to those who have suffered epistemic invalidation for months, years, or even decades, which allows us, in turn, to realize that this is a miracle we can all participate in. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. We briefly got disconnected on our end, but I'm glad y'all were able to keep going. We have a wired connection now, so hopefully we won't lose connection again. I'm gonna briefly pull up some slides for our last presenter, and he is in person. So we will get that set up. Just a moment, so just bear with me, please, while we get this set up. Thank you.
Should I just let you know when to transition slides?
Yeah, that'd be great. Go ahead and just speak and you can take your mask off since you're presenting. You go ahead and just say something and make sure everyone can hear you.
Okay, testing.
Can you hear
Can
him?
you hear me?
Perfect. Okay, so let me share screen.
Thanks, Microsoft Office.
Okay, here we go. Can everyone see this? All right, okay. Okay. All right. So let me introduce our last presenter. The title of this paper is Words Made Flesh, Space, Body, Language, and Community in Deaf Catholic Liturgy. The presenter is Christopher O'Brien from Catholic University of America. Chris is a PhD student studying liturgical studies, sacramental theology at the Catholic University of America. His interests include Eucharist, sacramental theology, ecumenism, ritual studies, embodiment in liturgy, liturgical theology, children and the sacraments, and ecclesiology. Chris is married and has 4 children. So please give a warm welcome for Chris.
Thank you to you for hosting, and thanks to the previous presenters for your insightful talks. And thanks to all of you who are here, both in person and virtually. To give a short image description, I'm a white male with blonde hair. I'm wearing a dark blue suit and a white shirt and a blue tie, and I'm standing off to the side of the projector screen. The title of my paper, Words Made Flesh, Space, Body, Language, and Community in Deaf Catholic Liturgy, is particularly, and I admit unintentionally, fitting today on this Feast of the Annunciation, when Christians celebrate the incarnation of the divine Word. This paper aims to reflect on the ways in which the Word becomes flesh again and again in deaf Catholic liturgical worship. In 1985, an ecumenical document now known as the Claggett Statement applied liberation theology to the experience of the deaf community in American Christian churches. As Marlana Portolano observes, the statement, quote, boldly asked churches to reflect on their contribution to the oppression of deaf people, and, quote, agreed that deaf people did not need liberation from being deaf, but rather from social exclusion and cultural oppression. In the statement's words, the church has considered deaf people to be handicapped and intellectually and morally inferior, and has not recognized deaf people as persons equipped with theological and cultural gifts with which to enrich the life of the whole church. The development of deaf Catholic liturgy since the 1970s, including the ordination of deaf Catholic priests, has provided one important source for the social and cultural liberation called for by the Claggett Statement. This paper, through an ethnographic study of one particular deaf Catholic community, explores the spatial, bodily, linguistic, and communal dimensions of deaf Catholic worship in order to analyze the challenges that deaf Catholic liturgy faces, as well as the ways in which it succeeds in accomplishing social, cultural, and spiritual liberation for deaf Catholics. The paper concludes by highlighting some of the gifts that the deaf Catholic community has to offer the broader Christian church. I humbly acknowledge that my perspective as one who is familiar with the Roman Rite liturgy, but an outsider to the deaf community, can draw certain insights, but is also quite limited. Section 1, space and body. So we go, slide. Thank you. St. Francis is a small liturgical space with room for about 60 congregants. A small wooden altar is front and center and is flanked on one side by a tabernacle, set back against the wall, and on the other side by an ambo. Chairs are set up facing the altar in 4 semicircular rows. An open central aisle divides the chairs into 2 sections. Behind the altar is a wall-mounted crucifix, which hangs in front of a grid of clay-red plaster panels. Each panel has a handprint on it, and the handprints are arranged behind the crucifix so that they emanate away from it. Slightly larger panels to the left and right of the crucifix show hands signing ASL for Jesus. Stained glass windows depicting saints or gospel scenes adorn the sides and the back walls of the church, and include St. Francis of Assisi, St. Therese of Lisieux, and Jesus healing a deaf man. My primary reflections concerning space have to do with visual access, which is particularly vital for deaf Catholic liturgy. During one visit, a young woman sat in front of me and then turned and signed what I presumed to mean, "Am I blocking your vision?" and slid over 2 seats. The particular need for visual access in the deaf community affects the arrangement of physical space as well as the body posture of the community. At St. Francis, the congregation tends to stay seated for the entire Mass, except for the Our Father, Communion, and some people kneeling during the Eucharistic prayer. I eventually realized that this was because sitting maximized visual access to the readings and to the other signed elements of Mass. In the deaf community, adequate visual access, created by church architecture, furniture arrangement, and communal body postures, is akin to having strong acoustics and a good sound system in a church where the liturgy is primarily spoken. Next slide, please. Margaret Mary Kelleher suggests that, quote, when one goes into the field to study the Eucharist, one has to pay attention to the ritual body performing the liturgy. It is a body of bodies, involved in negotiating its identity as the body of Christ realized in this particular place. In my visits to St. Francis, it struck me that, while limited visual access constrained the actions of standing, kneeling, and sitting, engaging in the prayers of the Mass in American Sign Language seemed inherently more embodied than quietly murmured verbal responses, such as, "And with your spirit." Next slide, please. Section 2, language. The use of ASL as a liturgical language presents a number of challenges as well as gifts the deaf community has to offer the broader church. One challenge faced by the deaf Catholic community occurs in places during the liturgy when rubrics indicate a physical gesture meant to accompany spoken words. For instance, it is difficult for a deaf priest to simultaneously hold up the Eucharistic elements and sign the words of institution. Father Min, the pastor, solved this difficulty by first signing the words of institution pertaining to the bread, then holding up the host, and doing similarly with the cup. Another example of this challenge occurs from the assembly's perspective, when the rubrics indicate to say, "Glory to you, O Lord," while signing the forehead, lips, and heart. Another significant challenge has to do with translation of the liturgy into ASL. Contrary to what some might assume, ASL is not simply a signed form of spoken English. Rather, ASL is a unique, fully functioning language with its own syntax, grammar, and vocabulary. Thus, translating a liturgical text into ASL is not as simple as reading the English text and signing it. ASL also has a spatial dimension that is foreign to spoken English. In order to deal with these inherent linguistic challenges, lectors often use guides for proclaiming the lectionary readings in ASL, which reorder the words of each reading to correspond with ASL syntax. With regard to ASL's spatial dimension, conventions have been developed that make it clear, for example, whether he in the liturgy refers to the Father, the Son, or the Holy Spirit at various points. A third challenge in translation concerns vocabulary. Technical, liturgical, and theological words like consubstantial or even worthy do not have obvious signs in ASL. Fingerspelling, which is often used to communicate a word that lacks a sign, is less than ideal in a liturgical context. With the release of a new English translation of the Mass in 2011, which came with an increase in technical liturgical vocabulary, a national team collaborated to create a series of videos titled "The New Roman Missal for Interpreters" to support the deaf community's implementation of the new missal. One liturgical step that has not yet taken place is the approval of a Eucharistic prayer in ASL, as has been done in British Sign Language. A foray into the phenomenology of sign language begins to reveal some of the gifts that the deaf community has to offer Catholic worship and Christian communal prayer more broadly. One set of questions I asked as I embarked on this study was, are there significant experiential differences between speaking with your hands and speaking with your vocal cords? And if so, how do these differences impact communication, relationships, and here, liturgical worship? Because of my own limited ASL, my understanding of the phenomenology of ASL relies on the experience of the two interpreters I interviewed. Interpreters are particularly well situated to answer comparative questions about the two languages because they are familiar with both. A shortcoming of this approach is that both interpreters I interviewed spoke English as their first and primary language, while ASL was a second learned language. My own initial sense from attending the liturgy at St. Francis and from witnessing the communications of community members was that speaking in ASL was more embodied and thus closer to involving the whole person in the act of communication than spoken English. Further, because ASL relies on visual input, I observed that greater eye contact was required when signing ASL than spoken English, which to me suggested that ASL was somehow more intimate than spoken English. While my hypothesis was perhaps overly simplistic, it was also partially affirmed through the interviews. One seminarian interpreter, Trevor, said of conversing in ASL, "You can see the thing in what's being signed, because a lot of signs look like what they signify." Put in another way, for Trevor, speaking English is more akin to dealing with ideas, whereas ASL is more akin to dealing in persons. You can't separate the idea from the person as easily, he said, in ASL, and ASL, quote, lends itself to more personal connection. With regard to the liturgy, for Trevor, there is indeed an added quality of intimacy experienced through use of ASL. Quote, the words of the prayers aren't just the words of the prayers. Rather, they are embodied, personally connected words. For Trevor, this is especially apparent in the words of the priests. Quote, in persona Christi seems to come out more in ASL. This insight was also supported by Father Min, who emphasized that when deaf people see a deaf priest celebrating Mass, they can better understand the incarnation. Jesus is incarnated through the priest as a deaf person. One moment in which this is particularly clear is the homily. Father Min preaches, as he says, quote, straight from my heart and my head. And he continues, the deaf people want to see it, want to look in your eyes, want to see body movements. Another phenomenon pointed out by Trevor was the way that name signs are decided upon in deaf culture. Whereas in spoken English, names are chosen at birth and usually do not change, in ASL, name signs often communicate something about one's personality, interests, or physical characteristics. A particular interest to me was observing that Jesus Christ is signed by successively touching the middle finger of each hand to the center palm of the opposite hand, as is seen in the picture. Thus, every time a person signs Jesus' name, they are reminded that he is the crucified one, not merely intellectually, but by physically inscribing Jesus' crucified nature into their own body. Not only is his crucifixion marked on the bodies of worshipers, but they themselves are marked as members of his body and participants in his saving passion, death, and resurrection. In her article, Becoming Signs of God, a Theological Aesthetics of Sign Language in the Liturgy, Grace Agolia argues that sign language contributes to, quote, the essential nature of liturgical beauty, namely, quote, participation in Christ, which occurs by entering into the ontology of self-gift and becoming attuned to the offering of one's being in liturgical prayer. Though she does not focus explicitly on the sign for Jesus, she points out that, quote, because of its bodily and relational nature, communication offered to God in sign language facilitates a profound entrance into the mystery of Christ's kenotic act. Next slide, please. Section 3, Community. I was particularly struck by the close-knit community of St. Francis. Over the course of my several visits, the community participated in a blessing of animals, a presentation by a missionary about a deaf Catholic community in Cambodia, a birthday celebration, a benediction service, and weekly post-Mass lunches. Despite the significant diversity of ethnicity, age, state of life, and physical ability, parishioners were brought together by the common experience of deafness, the common language of ASL, and a shared Catholic faith. My interview with Father Min corroborated the idea that the experience of deafness, along with the shared language of ASL, brings deaf people together in an intimate way. Father Min does not understand deafness as a disability, but as a way of being that comes with particular cultural gifts. As Trevor put it, asking a deaf person, do you wish you were not deaf, is akin to asking an American, do you wish you were French? Despite Father Min's worry about a future loss of deaf culture in the church, the community of St. Francis appears to be a healthy and active one. Conclusion, so last slide. From challenges to gifts. Despite the significant challenges that the deaf community continues to face, this community also has much to teach and offer the broader church. First, the visual aspect of worship that Deaf Catholic liturgy highlights is worth reflection by all Christian liturgists. Greater respect for visual access by architects and others involved in liturgical planning not only helps deaf people, but aids the active participation of the entire congregation. Secondly, the Deaf Catholic community, along with its allies and advocates, models persistence for the broader church. The stories of Father Min, the flourishing St. Francis community, and many other deaf Catholics are stories of persistence in the face of continual trial. Lastly, deaf Catholic worship, along with deaf culture, reminds the broader church of, this is a quote from an interviewee, the beauty of communion. The important concept of ephatha, or be opened, sums up this value well. For the deaf community, Jesus' opening of the ears of the deaf man is miraculous not only because the deaf man can hear, but because the man, now able to communicate with others, is reintegrated into the community. Though Jesus does not take away the deafness of most deaf Catholics, he does, through the deaf Catholic community, open them by integrating them into the community and letting them give of themselves. As Agolia puts it, the use of sign language in the liturgy opens positions of leadership for deaf worshipers, giving them a sense of empowerment, which reflects on their participation in the liturgy. This opening that occurs in deaf Catholic worship is a model of hope for enculturation, evangelization, and a joyful future, both in the deaf Catholic community and in the entire church. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, everyone, every presenter. So now we are going to go into our Q&A time. So if you have a question, let's use, you can either type it in the chat, if you don't want to be seen and don't want to say anything, you type in your chat and I can read your question aloud. If you want to use the raising hand feature to ask your question to one of our presenters, that'd be great too. And then to our in-person audience, feel free to raise your hand. So I will just open the floor now to anyone that has any questions, comments, just wants to just say something. So the floor is yours. We do have a question in the audience, so I'm gonna change the camera. And when you have a question, can we see you?
Well, yeah.
If you have a question, say your name, where you are coming from.
Sure, yeah, I'm Elizabeth Foster. I use she, her pronouns, and I am from VU. I'm an UMDIT student here. I am a white woman with sort of auburn hair wearing a black dress. And I'm so sorry, I can't see your names right now, but this is just a question for Matthew, and I'm so sorry, I'm forgetting your...
Dory.
Sorry, yes, thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. I just wanted to ask, do you think that Catholic bioethics might call us to implement something that looks maybe a little more like universal design? And are there ways it might call us to sort of go even a little beyond some of what, not that what you all are talking about isn't fantastic.
I'm sorry, would you mind repeating that last
Yeah, no,
bit?
not at all. Yeah, I think you sort of talked some about getting beyond the medical model of disability and sort of moving more towards implementing a social model. And I'm wondering if you think that, if you're familiar with the principles of sort of universal design in education at all, and if you think that that might be something that Catholic bioethics might call us to implementing in Catholic schools and other Christian education spaces.
I'm not super familiar with universal design in education spaces. I don't know anything about it, but I mean, certainly it seems like there would be some, it seems like you're asserting that there could be some sort of, they could at least be conversation partners and there could be some mutually beneficial applications in that.
Yeah,
and I would be very interested to sort of investigate that more.
Yeah, sorry, I don't mean to put you on the spot. I
No
think it's something that you would be interested in being in conversation about, because yeah, as fantastic as everything you propose would be, I wonder if sort of some of that special education funding does still lean a little bit towards that medical model in some ways. So that just might be something to sort of look towards in expanding this.
I think it definitely does. However, I think that, you know, to Tatum's point earlier, just maybe, you know, recontextualizing these steps in more of in grounding them more of a cultural context would be would certainly go a long way toward that. So yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that your presentation was great, and this is like a very important thing to be considered.
And Tatum, thank you, by the way.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question, Elizabeth. Anyone online that would like to ask a question? Presenters, you can also ask questions of the other presenters. Yes, Amy, I see you kind of.
Yeah. Hi. Sorry, I was looking for the raise hand button. I'm Amy Kenny, coming in from California today. I'm a white woman in my 30s with shoulder length blonde hair, wearing black. So I noticed throughout all of the spectacular presentations how much overlap and kind of crosstalk there was between them, which was fantastic. The importance of disability culture in Dory and Matthew and Tatum's, the validating of the lived experience of invisible disabilities in Heather's, and then the embodied benefit of ASL in Christopher's. And all of them seem to focus on the embodied wisdom of disability and the way that disability can be a gift and a teacher, which was wonderful. So my question for all of you is just kind of what you noticed in each other's presentations that connects to your own work, what ways that you can think about, like, all of us collaborating on this bigger project of encouraging for disability to be understood as a type of embodied wisdom that you noticed in each other's presentations.
Great question. Personally, I mean, I'm more focused on the education bit. So hearing more about the spirituality angle was certainly very enlightening to me, and it's an area of growth for me. So I was definitely inspired by Heather and Chris's presentations. I don't know whether I have anything constructive to add, just admiration. And I read a call for my own expansion of perception.
Similarly, I deal more with the theological aspects of all of this stuff, and hearing Matt's portion and Tatum's and Chris's really kind of helped me think more concretely about what we can actually do. And just because thinking theologically and more broadly about these topics is wonderful, and that also doesn't necessarily translate well to concrete action steps. And if this is something that needs to happen, there has to be a way to implement it. I also deeply appreciated Heather's presentation, simply because biblical studies is not my area at all. And I just deeply appreciated the imaginative, creative, and just deeply respectful and careful way you sort of reframed this whole narrative of Hannah. And no, it gives me as somebody who's more interested in sort of comparative and ethical aspects of theology a lot of pause and a lot of thinking to do about how to sort of how these kinds of how these sort of biblical interpretations can nuance and inform my own work. So thank you.
Yeah, I think one connection I was seeing was, I guess in Matt and Dory's presentation, the shift you're talking about from from the medical to the social way of seeing disability and reacting to it, and in schools. I think there's a similar shift that the deaf community desires in their just in their acceptance into the broader culture, right? Of kind of how they're perceived as kind of shifting from people who are different with a certain disability to a cultural identity that has gifts to offer the rest of society and the rest of the church, just like any other cultural group. So I see a similar shift there that you're talking about.
One thing that strikes me is the way in which this discussion has moved back and forth between different points of perspective in terms of the conversation, and the ways in which different views allow us to see different elements of the disabled experience. But I think that that remains a tension that needs to continue to be leaned into more fully, to ensure that the voices of those with disabilities are being included in these conversations, whether it's at a school level, whether it's in our ethnographic process, whatever the work is that we're doing as folks with disabilities, making or about disabilities, making sure that we are finding ways to hear those lived voices, I think is really crucial to our success in hearing what is going on. And I think that that's a tension that this conference is here to try to live into, and I really appreciate and value that element.
I'll jump in too and just say that I, as a first year master's student, am thinking about disability theology stuff all the time. And last year in my undergrad wrote an honors project about Christ embodied and disability. And so it was really cool really to hear all three of the presentations today. And particularly with Heather's presentation on Hannah, I've thought a lot about different in my own writing, have thought a lot about different people in the Bible who have encountered God and had a connection with God and have not been healed of a disability. Because I think that's really important to notice that there are a lot of those instances too, and that not all encounters are just healing. And so I love that connection that you made, Heather, and will have that in my head for the rest of my schooling, at least, if not even into ministry stuff that I'm doing. And with Chris's focus on the language and the naming and how embodied that was, I think was also really helpful. And honestly, just as a master's student and a disabled person, like I said in my paper, it was really validating to hear Matt and Dory's paper, because that is really it's really what we need. So yeah, I think all of that has really helped me, at least, in kind of understanding the embodiment of disability and God better.
On a more personal note, just thinking about disability culture as something to be implemented. I have lived most of my life, basically within the medical model of disability, where I'm sure that this has happened. This is a semi-universal experience, where my disability was treated as something that needed to be overcome, fixed, etc. So, thinking about my own limitations, when writing this paper, I think the experience across all three presentations is that I don't need to choose. Basically, when I wrote this paper, when I wrote my portion, at least, I thought to myself, okay, well, I need to choose between air quote, practicality, close, air quote, or culture. But I don't. And that's really heartening. So.
I see that Naomi has their hand raised. Naomi, would you like to ask a question?
This question is for the person who spoke about schools.
That's me.
My name is Naomi. I'm from Ontario, Canada. I am a white woman who uses a wheelchair and AC. I am wondering how you involve peers in school without making them helpers and not friends.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I understand your question. Can you clarify a bit?
I both speak and use AAC. How do you make peers involved in other students' lives without taking away from them being friends and making them just helpers?
Is it more generally or in my specific experience?
How would you do that? Because
it's a hard
it's a
line
fine
to
line to walk, because I've
yeah.
walked that line.
I see we're on the same wavelength. So I honestly, that's not like the third point I made with teacher attitude. In general, it's not. There's no elegant solution in my experience. I think that the least the least messy path, the path of least resistance in my personal experience, has been to generally educate and kind of cross my fingers and hope for growth from there, as opposed to addressing things issue by issue. You know, just changing teacher attitude for me came from educating as opposed to correcting, which in turn affected my own actual classroom teaching. So I'm sorry if it's not clearer. It's close as I can get, though.
Could I jump in on that one as well? Because I, like, as respondent, kind of, I have thought about this a lot because I am visually impaired and have peers get paid to read textbooks out loud to me. And so it's really like a daily thought process of mine of like, these are my peers and they're my friends. And I usually intentionally choose people who are my friends, which then makes it a little bit weirder even. But I have kind of two thoughts, story kind of thoughts, I guess. One of them is one of my best friends who I actually wrote about in my honors project, who is also disabled, and we lived together for a year. And we both knew kind of the collective care thing that I had talked about in my paper, that ends in like care not becoming this like unfortunate thing that we have to do, but becoming even deeply joyful. And so my friend and roommate and I like kind of found ways to make, we really like cared for each other, like her particular needs with my particular needs. Like she would read stuff out loud. I would I don't know, do her laundry in my bathtub because she was allergic to scents, like whatever. We would just like make things work together. And we found like this joy in it. And now I have a roommate who is abled and who is my one of my readers, and that relationship has also taken a little bit of a like an interesting thing because she doesn't have a disability, but I'm working with her right now kind of to like work on a big project that she's doing, and she's helping then with my classes and stuff like that. And so I think kind of just finding that aspect of like friendship and joy in the care, which I know can't happen all the time, but if you're able to find those moments of like friendship within it, has been really helpful for me.
All right, thank you so much, everyone who presented. It was so wonderful. We do have a break now, and we have our keynote speaker, Dr. Sharon Betra, at 11:30. So we hope you can all join us there. Just one more quick Congratulations to everyone who presented. They were wonderful. Yeah, thank you. Take care, everyone.